So, I named this presentation Doing Good and Doing Well in the Pharma Space. And, I don't claim to own this, particular, phrase. Actually, it was coined by one of our previous CEOs of Mylan. There was a lady, Heather Bresch, and she used to be very interested, and she was a big proponent and give us a lot of push into what we were doing in the HIV space. She was very interested. She visited Africa. She visited different places, came back with a deep understanding of the space, and really personally took a lot of interest in ensuring that we gave a lot to this space. So, and she used to say that there are a lot of people who do well in terms of financially, in terms of making money, in terms of reaching patients, but then doing good and doing well, very few companies and very few programs and companies are able to achieve as a twin objective. It's not easy, and while going forward, you'll probably understand more about what I'm saying. I've also structured this talk in such a way that you understand a bit about the pharma industry, because many of you might not have worked in the pharma industry, might have little understanding of the space. It's always good to have a little background in terms of industry structure, in terms of what kind of companies are present in this space, what these companies do. So just a brief background, and then we'll go into more about how you do good and do well in this industry. Let's go to the next slide. So if you look at the global pharma market, I mean, that's how we always look at the market size in terms of treating patients, and this is the value of patients' lives broadly. I mean, if you look at it in a different way, this is what is spent on treating patients across the world, which is like $2,000 billion in 2026. Today it's around 1,650. That's 1.6 trillion US dollars. And there are some things about this market. I mean, it's a market from the 1980s, which has been stable. It doesn't have these, typical up and downs like, like the oil sector or, engineering sector or any sector. It's a pretty stable market. You will also find that, there's a clear distinction between the way the regulated markets, we call them regulated or developed markets in the space, which is US, Europe, Japan, Australia, how these markets behave and what those patients need, versus the emerging markets in terms of what they need, how patients behave there, and what their requirements are, what disease patterns are visible. In terms of this, you will not find the same disease patterns in America today as you will find in Africa. So that's one part. Second thing is, you need to understand that there are 7 billion people in the world. 1.1 billion maybe of this population stays in these developed markets. And these developed markets, by value, they contribute more than 90% of the pharma. So you are to 1.6 trillion, 1.4 trillion probably, or 1.45 trillion will come from US, Europe, Japan, Australia, and these markets, and the rest of the markets are left with that whatever the remaining. You can calculate it yourself. So that's the dichotomy with which we work in the pharma space, and that's how it's been. I mean, if you look at the data from 2000 or 1990s in terms of market size and percentage of market size owned by these big geographies or developed markets, it's always been the same. Okay, then let's go forward. You will find that you'll have a growing and aging population, let's say, in most of these markets, these developed markets. There's an increase in focus on rare and specialty diseases because the US, Europe, most of the diseases are treatable. People have access to these diseases. They need not pay for this. The governments pay for them, or there's a co-pay mechanism where the individual pays something and the government pays something. And there is always, the focus to treat more in these markets and in these countries because there is enough money available to pay for those treatments. So a lot of R&D is focused on specialty diseases, innovations in advanced biologics, cell therapies, even though you'll find that in the other part of the world, which is your 10% of size and 90% of patients, People are still dying of basic diseases. People don't have access to basic vaccination. People have HIV, living with it, and there's no one to treat them with treatments which cost as little as $60 per patient per year. So this is the dichotomy that we live with, in this pharma space. Also, if you look at what's happened, if you look at the kind of industry structure you have, when you talk about the pharma space, you have big companies like Pfizer, Merck, Abbott. Suri, one of my batchmates, works for Abbott. But these are big companies. They spend a lot on original R&D, which is discovering new chemical entities or new biological entities, and they spend huge billions of dollars on making these products, developing these products, making these products, bringing them to market, and then pricing them in such a way that they get the benefit of, not benefit, let's say they can afford to continue their R&D programs in these spaces. So that's how many of these companies work. On the other side, there are other companies which are called generic companies across the world. Nowadays, now the innovators move towards generics. Generics move towards innovators in terms of owning brands. There is some sort of overlap between these companies today, but then fundamentally the generic innovator divide still exists in the pharma industry. You have companies like ours, Viatris, we have a company called Teva, we have all the other Indian companies, Cipla, Lupin, Dr. Reddy's, Ranbaxy, you name Sun Pharma, you name the company, most of them are, mostly generic companies. In generic companies, the focus is more on when these innovator companies bring these, products to market. They have something called patents, which stay for 20, 25 years, and then they go off patent. And the generic company enters that space at that point of time, quickly brings down the cost, focuses on production, commercialization of these products. And you will find that these companies probably don't spend as much in terms of R&D as the innovator companies, but they bring down the cost of these products so much and increase the affordability across the world. So let's go to the next slide. I'll give you an example. If you look at US as a market, for example, you have a population of like 40 million, and then 73% of that population is served by generic medicines. Only 27% have they have access to to the innovative medicines. And imagine in terms of volume, what kind of market size divide is there? What kind of market size divide is there? 27% of this market is owned by innovators, and you see the market size. So it's an extraordinary dichotomy. I mean, you look at Europe, it's similar. You look at any of these developed. You look at Japan or China. It's the same. Even in those markets, most of the populations and most of the diseases are served by generic companies. But the discounting of those prices is so severe that your market size contribution will be hardly anything compared to what the innovators charge. So that's the kind of industry that we serve. Let's move. Now, there's something called, this concept of public health markets. Before I come to public health markets, for those of you, who are listening to me, and, I wish, we had more people today. But, the thing is, when we talk about innovation, when we talk about, doing original R&D, when we talk about doing new things, what do we think about? We think about a Tesla, or we think about a Google, or we think about, I don't know, we think about tech companies, let's say Microsoft or, Apple. Apple is a highly innovative company. No one calls a pharma company highly innovative, even though they're into, new chemical entities, saving lives. And it's also because I think, we've tied ourselves into models which, the money is there, the patients are there, but we are not necessarily able to put those things together and bring and build business models which bring the money to those patients who need the drugs. So I think that's one thing, where, we can do much more in pharma. And I hope that, we go forward, there's this new, when you all pass out, everyone wants to be an entrepreneur. There is money available. There are sharks and, something else, people are there sitting with money. But this is a space which has been largely ignored, not only because, people don't want to fund, but because these are simpler ideas, deal with people's lives. And I don't know, I mean, it doesn't sound as innovative or as exciting as, going to the moon, or, building a colony in space, or, getting something to your house in 15 minutes. It's a space which has been largely ignored. Let's move to that. If you look at, the biggest people, I mean, the smartest guys in the world, guys who built the biggest companies in the world, like, let's say, Bill Gates, he also talks about his biggest investment and the best investment he's made is founding something called the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which started the Clinton Health Access Initiative. So, he talks about reaching people, saving lives. They employ the most, they employ people from Harvard, from IIMs. They employ people from the most, premier institutes in the world. They work in Africa. They work across emerging markets to create, access to these patients. And access to these patients, typically when we talk about access to, patients who come from these backgrounds or from these countries, we talk about Pfizer doing corporate social responsibility, or, Merck spending 2 or 3% of its revenues to give away drugs. You do a donation, and then, it kind of, removes that feel, sometimes you feel empty, right? That, you've not done anything for this patient, so you do a donation. But then these are not sustainable ways of treating, let's say, 6 to 7 billion people who are, going to be there in these markets. So the thing that these, foundations and initiatives also drove and made us also understand, as when we were in part of, Mylan at that time, Viatris, now that you have to build a business model which kind of pays for itself, reaches these patients, and these are all chronic diseases. HIV and AIDS, malaria, etc. are chronic diseases. Once you have a tablet, you have to have that tablet for the rest of your life every day if you want to live. It's not like, you treat someone and then you go away. It's not like, a vaccine or something else. You need to have a tablet every day. So they kind of, made us understand and, looked at our strengths and said, probably you can do this if you build a business around this. If you are going to do it for charity, it's not going to work. So that's where, probably this thinking started, and, this need to build businesses, successful businesses around treating people in emerging markets and making these businesses pay for themselves. I think that thinking probably started in early 2000s. And now it has actually become, a successful business model around which, a number of companies work. Let's go ahead. I think, companies create legacies when they make positive impact on the society. And it's not just the American society or, the European society. There are people living across the world. And, when you have smart people in an organization, you don't use them to solve problems only where, it's easy to solve problems. You require them to solve complex problems of the world. And this is the basis on which we started recruiting people. Even, I was drawn into this probably in 2006, 2007, when I joined Matrix, saying, okay, this is a place where you have a career, you have work diversity, you are solving problems of people, and then you also need to have a persuasive story to tell in terms of numbers, in terms of finances, in terms of number of people reached, to make this business model sustainable and possible for other people to attempt across the world. Let's move. So if you look at the pharma market, so if you look at the major difference between public markets and private markets, I think it is basically the ability of a patient to pay for the drug that he's taking. Why do you require public procurement? You can do it, hospitals like Apollo or Fortis, they do it for a different reason. They do it for, economies of scale. They do it for economies of purchasing. They do it for that. But when a government, like say, purchases drugs, when, through NGOs, through the Ministry of Health, through UN organizations, they do it mostly because they want volume-driven purchasing, they want cost leadership, they want tender-based procurement, and they want access to a large patient pool. And these are mostly patients, 99% of patients who cannot pay for these drugs. In a private market, of course, it's, the marketing is value-driven, brand differentiation, you have brands and branded generics in the market, you have comparatively high margins, and it's entirely out of pocket or insurance-driven. In India, it's not insurance-driven. We don't have a complete, policy yet, but you'll find that in most of the developed markets, it's insurance-driven, payments that happen in this place. Let's move further. So if we attempt to define these public health markets and, where they work and, what organizations are involved in this space, you have essentially, 139 low and middle income countries. That's what we call them, which is 80% of the population. And this is your 5.8 billion, which I was talking about in the beginning. And there are a number of UN organizations. There are, of course, the foundations like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Clinton Foundation. There are UN organizations. There are organizations called the President's Program for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR in the US. There is an organization called the Global Fund, which puts together money from the G20 countries, collects money from them, and then uses it to fund, patients who need treatment for HIV, malaria, TB, hepatitis C, family planning, and other infectious diseases in these 139 markets. So most of the funding for these organizations, for these patients, comes from either the US or the developed countries. And lately, what we have also seen is that India has started contributing to these organizations. China has started contributing. Brazil is starting to contribute. So more and more countries are moving from being receivers of these funds to donors in this space. So that's something which is also heartening to see. We can move forward. In public health markets, how do you do good? Basically, you have to have you are not selling directly to the patient. The Ministry of Health, donor finance entities, they are the primary buyers. They're big buyers, handle huge amounts of funds. They behave like any other institutional, authority. Buying decisions, might be driven by the politics of public health priorities. Growth or decline can depend on, the WHO and the Ministry of Health, their normative guidelines, their funding levels. It's not as if, everything is hunky-dory there and only logic exists. There is, I'd say, different points of view and different pushes and pulls in terms of, defining what a country needs. What the WHO puts on its guidelines, based on which a country decides what it needs. So there's a lot of push and pull, but, it still is more efficient than the private market, especially when you're buying for, let's say in HIV, it's a 30-40 million across people across the world who take their pill every day. And when you're buying for these kind of, volumes, you need to have, some sort, you cannot have a patient-centered approach. The latest thing in pharmaceuticals, if you look at Pfizer, if you look at Novartis presentations, if you look at, everyone talks about customizing drugs at a patient level, at a person level. That is not possible, when you're looking at, 5.8 billion patients, or, even 1% of that patients, which exists in the HIV therapeutic area. So what you do is you create, your own idea of what is required, with including doctors, researchers, people come together and say, okay, this is what makes sense. Cost effectiveness is important. Ability to pay is not important. It's only cost effectiveness and the availability of the governments and the international agencies to buy. And that's why the pricing in these is the most important part that drives the thinking in these markets, in this public health space. And the revenue also, it can be it can be rapid. It can be, the growth can happen usually because of the volumes involved, but it's not driven by ability to pay. It's more driven by multi-party negotiations. It's what the costing is pretty well known. There are a number of players in the market who understand the cost of these products. It's a question of pricing and leveraging your portfolio to ensure that you have a business model that works. Let's go ahead. So I just thought I'll put together one slide in terms of for you all to understand what's the difference between how a Pfizer behaves and let's say how a Viatris HIV/AIDS unit behaves in terms of sales and COGS and R&D, AOI, etc. If you look at these big pharma companies, I mean, they spend let's say if they achieve a sale of 100 units, their gross margins will be close to 80 to 90%. They do a lot of spend on SG&A marketing to ensure that they're getting the value for the brand that they're promoting. There is a huge R&D spend, which is maybe 4 to 5 times what a generic company spends. So you will get an AOI, which is probably maybe this 25-30% will be more 35-40, but then you will get an AOI which is significantly higher than what a generic company spends. In a generic company, what you'll find is that the gross margins will be lower. The SG&A spend is lower because you don't spend as much on brand building, having a field force, building offices in different countries. You're spending more on reach and distribution. So, and your R&D spend, if you look at your line after the net income, is much lower than these. But then if you look at the AOI level, there is still enough to build a significant volume business with enough AOI to generate enough money, not only to satisfy the shareholders of the organization, but also to invest back into these space and make it sustainable in terms of letting this business sustain itself for 10-15 years instead of doing just donations or charity which can last 1 year and you stop immediately when organization does not do it. So that's the I think that's the finances and how these how these businesses work in public health markets. Let's move on. There's examples. I thought I should give you some examples of public health programs. And if you look at the vaccines programs, there's an organization called Gavi, which has they have treated almost 100 million people across the world with the rotavirus and pneumococcal from the GSK. Then there's Cepheid's Gene Expert platform, which does TB tests. It has reached over 6 million people. The HIV/AIDS program, which we run in Viatris and other companies are part of, we've treated people. We treat more than 30 million patients per year on antiretrovirals. The malarial program across the world is completely funded, and you still will you'll be surprised to know that there are 150 million patients across the world who still suffer from malaria. So that's that's a big program. Of course, the biggest program which I think all of us are aware of. Some of us acknowledge it. Some of us still crib about it. But the COVID-19 vaccine program, which the government of India put together along with Serum and with we reached 1 billion people. And if you look at across the world, 144 participants, 1 billion people. And if we didn't have this program in India, with the vaccine inequality which was there, and the way the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, everything was only going to US and Europe. Can you imagine what state we would have been in India today if we didn't have this vaccine and if we didn't have these generic companies which were producing these vaccines at the scale that is required for a country like India? Just take a step back, look at these numbers. It's probably the biggest successful health program ever launched in the world in terms of vaccines. Let's move. So when we talk about access markets, we talk about the goal of a public health program is to create and maximize access to medicines and diagnostics to most vulnerable populations for a better health and for a better world. And that's a decent definition in terms of when you look at the dichotomy, which I said that, if you have a 90% by value of all pharmaceutical products produced in the world, they're consumed by a mere 15% of the global population. So you have 10% of value left for 85% of the population. And as I said, the key elements of successful commercialization in these markets, you need to have regulatory coverage. Pharmaceutical products are regulated. You need to have dossiers. You need to compile a lot of data into these products, file these products across the world, make them acceptable to countries which are buying these products. There's production scale up, COGS optimization, and incremental innovation. Innovation is just not creating patents. Innovation is also giving away these patents, like many of these innovators companies have done in the space, in the HIV/AIDS space, to other companies which can actually make use of the freedom they have to provide treatment to patients. Otherwise, these patents are essentially blocking. They don't allow you to innovate rightfully in, let's say, to treat patients in US or Europe. But what about the patients in Africa? What about the patients in emerging markets? What about the patients in Asia who don't have access to these? Considering all this, a new model was established. Let's go to the next slide. So there was something called creating market access through licensing. This was probably again born around 2005 to 2010, where the Medicines Patent Pool, it's an organization which has been built by the UN organizations. It came into existence and basically said more than 2 billion people across the world lack even access to health products and essential medicines. Many of these people live in low and middle income in countries. So to treat these patients, you needed the innovators who had a number of patents on these products, on a lot of these products across the world, to give away their patents into a pool and then make this pool accessible to a number of generic companies, which will then come together, take these patents, prepare their own combinations of these products and offer these products in these LMICs to treat patients. There were pros and cons. The pros were to reduce cost of medicine, the better access to patients. There's always this problem, between innovators and generics. They will fight. They will have legal battles. It causes, loss of time and money. But then mostly, I think, these programs have worked very well in terms of creating access to patients living in, our markets, which is these 5.8 billion people. Let's move. The voluntary licensing, as I said, it's a win-win proposition. I think these voluntary licenses, which these innovators gave to generic companies, they're non-confrontational. They take into account the concerns of all parties, whether it's public health interest groups, consumers, generic drug manufacturers, and originator pharmaceutical companies, and reach some sort of balance in terms of providing access to the generics while ensuring that the innovators get some credit and value out of it. There is royalty payments for innovators in some cases. Then even the originator of pharma companies, they gained the lost goodwill. I mean, there was a huge hue and cry, in early 2000s about this HIV/AIDS disease, and the fact that there were so many big pharmaceutical companies across the world at that time. They were doing well for 20 years. They had been doing well, but they had no answer no answer on how to combat this. And at that time, malaria was becoming a killer. TB was becoming a killer. So the number of diseases that were being added to HIV/AIDS, it created a huge uproar. So in terms of innovators also, they probably realized that their business model, it doesn't allow them to treat these patients in the way that a generic company can. So I think this was the way the innovators and the generics and the global health community came together to treat patients who needed treatment in these markets. Let's move. Then again, examples are so many. I mean, if you look at the HIV/AIDS business, Gilead Sciences had a product called Viread. Viread is the brand name. Tenofovir disoproxil fumarate is the generic name, and this particular drug probably treats 25 million patients across the world in HIV/AIDS today. Similarly, in hepatitis C, there's a drug called sofosbuvir, which was launched in the US. It was marketed at $84,000 per patient per patient in the US, and the generic version today is available at $60 per patient in low and middle. So you can imagine a generic company makes 30% at $60, an innovator company makes 90% or 95% at $84,000. So the amount of work that has happened in terms of re-engineering, in terms of cost optimization, in terms of delivery platform optimization is huge in generic companies. Similarly, we have a product called dolutegravir, which is the lead product for treating HIV/AIDS patients across the world today, and the product today is available at less than $5 per patient per month. So these are the innovations which have created access to 40 million patients living with HIV/AIDS in the world. Let's move. Yeah, quickly, I think I'll take you to one or two slides in terms of how we've built this antiretroviral franchise in Viatris Mylan and how it's become a public health success story. I think the key success factors in terms of why we did well as Mylan in this space and we continue to do well is, I think innovation. You have to understand the public health space, understand the cost levers, understand the price levers, and build products which are still good for patients, extremely good for patients, but at a cost which is affordable. Second thing is you need to have a portfolio. Every patient cannot survive on the same product. So you need to have options. And the more options you have, the more the global buyers will come to you and ensure that they buy from you. Operational excellence across API and formulations. API is active pharmaceutical ingredients. Example, Crocin. Crocin is a brand. The active in a Crocin is paracetamol. Paracetamol, you just can't ingest it by itself. You need to add various, different chemicals, biological, to ensure that it's palatable to the human body. So those are called excipients. So the API and formulations, operational excellence across these spaces, commercial excellence in terms of dealing with these big buyers, ensuring that you have medical marketing activities and clinical engagements on the ground, and policy and networking with all these big agencies, Global Fund, PEPFAR, Clinton Foundation, Gates Foundation, so that you can build a successful presence in this space. Next slide. I think when we focus on what we have done in this space, we provided around, if there are 30 million patients or 25 million patients across the world in the emerging markets, 40% of these patients use a Viatris ARV on a daily basis. I think if you just take one point, in 2017 itself, we produced 4 billion ARV capsules and tablets, and we reached more than 100 countries in the world in terms of access to ARVs. More than 50% of our active ingredient capacity, which is expensive to build, is used for the production of antiretrovirals. And we've brought global gold standards of HIV/AIDS treatment. For example, tenofovir was available. Earlier, it used to take maybe 20-25 years for a drug which was available in the US and treating a patient to reach the emerging markets. We've kind of brought that down from 20-25 years to 2 to 3 years. In dolutegravir, we almost launched in emerging markets maybe a few years, maybe 24 months after the product got accepted in US and Europe. So that's the work that has been done in terms of bringing quick access to these newer products in these spaces. Next slide. I think we've been recognized for it. Fortune has a Change the World list, and Viatris was named 5th in that. If you look at the US FDA and if you look at the PEPFAR program, which is a President Program for Emergent AIDS Relief, more than 50% of the drugs approved in that space are Viatris drugs. We are the largest supplier of ARVs across the world. And while doing this, as I said, the turnovers are high. You can get, so we have also been the largest exporter from India for the past 3 years in terms of formulation exports in a award instituted by the Pharmaceutical Export Promotion Council. So I think, this is a space which requires much more attention. It requires incremental innovation. It requires people to understand that you can do good in this space and you can do well. And there are careers which are worth exploring in this space, for people who want to look at this space as a viable alternative in terms of you make your money, you help people, you travel, and above all, you have the satisfaction of reaching and treating a number of patients which probably no pharma company can easily achieve in the world.
No, I think you're good.
I think.
Okay, I think we'll end this meeting now. So thank you.